Oh my God, it's Kevin Tierney.
Hello, Mark.
How are you, Kevin?
Good. How are you?
Not too bad. It's an ungodly early hour for you.
Yes, I'm. It actually is. Though your talk is so timely that I decided I needed to stay up and listen to it.
Oh my God. Yikes.
I'm in the middle of trying to get derived importance for transit agencies.
Ooh, okay.
I'm lost in my random forest, Mark, and I need you to save me.
I wish I could help. Oh dear. And Ellen, our poor host, is probably wondering, who the heck are these guys? How's life treating you otherwise?
Well, how are you?
Pretty good. In lockdown today.
Uh-oh, something new happening over there?
Yeah, we've decided to get the Delta variant without having anybody be vaccinated. So
yes,
that's not a smart idea, actually.
Yeah, we have.
You have the Delta variant, but I think you at least you guys, most of you people are vaccinated.
Well, some of us, yes.
Well,
We have a strong.
Yeah, Massachusetts was one of those places I thought that had really high levels of vaccination.
Yeah, comparative to the other states. I'm just shocked that everyone in the world isn't just lining up for this over here.
Right.
Where it's available, wherever it's available. I can't believe you wouldn't stand in line twice to get it.
Exactly. Yeah. A waste of mystery. Yeah, over here we're having the same problem. If it's any consolation, we don't have any vaccines, so. But
yeah, right. No, I mean that's the pathetic thing is it's not it's here. It's not a question of not having it. It's just people too stupid to line up for it. I'm sorry. We're going down a political path that we.
That's right. Yeah, sorry. You're from Massachusetts, though, so people will expect you to be sort of socialists. We're already socialists over here in Australia anyway. So.
Hi, Mark. Hi, everyone.
Hello, Ellie. How are you?
Good. Thank you. We haven't still finished the previous track. I'm not sure about track 3E, but 4E still is running.
Oh, okay. The one that was previous that had Jonathan Corcoran running that one finished early. I was disappointed, actually. I logged in just to get Jonathan's talk, and I logged in, and then it ended like 2 minutes later. So that was really disappointing.
Oh, so sorry for that.
Well, maybe everybody talked fast, so.
I think we had two presenters that they pre-recorded themselves. I think that was the reason.
Okay.
But actually, in the other room, still they're busy. I talked too much on that room, so.
That's all right. It's been really nice to see all the discussion that's been generated by a lot of these talks and things like that. So that's great. That's a good result.
Yes, and then we will share the recordings. So don't be disappointed that you missed Jonathan's presentation. You're gonna see that
again,
later,
sneak it later.
Even on weekend or your lunch break or.
That's right.
So how it works? Actually, we're gonna record. We're actually recording all of these sessions, and then we will edit it and upload it on our YouTube. So even you can find the archive of the previous presentations on our BTR YouTube channel. I will share the link with everyone, with all of the registrants as well as you.
Cool.
Yes. So perhaps we can start, or shall we wait a few minutes? What time is it? Oh, we're 1 minute past. Yeah, I'm just cautious that other people may want to join us. If we can wait a few minutes.
Yeah,
Is it
no
all right,
problem.
Mark?
Yeah, fine with me.
Thank you.
Ask Kevin. It's some ungodly hour of the morning for him, and he's got to wait 2 minutes. So if he has to wait 2 extra minutes, he might fall asleep. So.
Yes, and we have Andisha also here.
That's right. Yeah, she's probably falling asleep too. Although she's on a different time zone than Kevin. Kevin's poor East Coast of US, and Andisha is still on the West Coast time. So
Yeah, for me it's 11 o'clock. It's not that bad.
oh, it's only is it only 11 o'clock?
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
it's
yeah, that's
11
right,
p.m.
right. Yeah, only 11 o'clock. Yeah. On a
And
Thursday
sure.
night. You don't have to work tomorrow, do you?
Yeah, tomorrow's Friday, so that's fine.
Very nice seeing you here, Andisha.
I know, lovely to see you too, Alnaz.
Yeah, well, I don't have any video, unfortunately, but that's all good. I'm from you. But I understand that's 11 p.m. I don't expect.
Yeah, you don't want to
Canada.
see me at 11 p.m.
I bet that won't be different from mine. Yeah, let me see if they finished it or not. Because we had like 11 people there. I don't really want them to miss your presentation, Mark.
So Elnaz, have you been watching the Western Hemisphere version too?
Well, I tuned in for Hani Mahmastani, to be honest, but
Yeah.
I realized that I couldn't understand. I couldn't focus. My mind was so tired. And then I thought, no, okay, I will listen to the recording.
Yeah, that's better.
Yeah.
There were several presentations on the Western one that I wanted to check out. So I'm glad you're uploading those. That would be very, very nice.
Yes, we have already uploaded some of those. They're unedited, but I can share the link with you anyway. But we will edit it and we'll scrap all of those in extra.
Those will be on the Bridging Transport website.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, cool.
So the archive tab on our website,
yeah.
Now it has all of the previous years, previous rounds, as if we had too many years. But yeah, so this one also, again, we'll upload it on the website, and then we will email all of the registrants with all of the links. And also, if you subscribe to YouTube channel, BTR YouTube channel, then also you will get the notification as soon as they get uploaded. I will post it in the social media as well.
Cool.
Yeah. Okay, I don't know how long would it take. So I think that we can start. And the recording is on, right? So let me introduce Professor Mark Hickman, our keynote speaker for the last track of, actually Eastern track here. So Professor Mark Hickman, actually I feel very privileged that I was his PhD student, and I grew, I can't believe that how much actually I grew under his supervision since I started my PhD in 2014. So I feel very, very lucky and very fortunate to have him as my PhD supervisor. And I hope that I have him always as my mentor. And yeah, anyhow. Professor Mark Hickman is the Transport Academic Partnership Chair, TAP Chair, and Professor of Transport Engineering within the School of Civil Engineering at the University of Queensland. He is also the director of the Transport Population Research Network, a network to coordinate transport and population research activities across several schools and faculties at UQ. Professor Hickman teaches and conducts research in public transit planning and operations, travel demand modeling, transport data analytics, and traffic engineering. And the keynote speak is about thinking about the transit customer, what service improvements drive satisfaction. And we are very looking forward to listening to you, Mark. And now I stop sharing my screen so that you can share. Over to you.
if I can get mine up here. Okay.
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, 1 second here. Let me make sure I've got this working. There we go. Hey, everyone. So thank you very much, Elnaz. It's great to have such great students that follow me around and arrange great things like BTR. I think this is really the first year that I've had the opportunity to participate in this conference, and I've really enjoyed it. I've participated in a couple other virtual conferences over the last year or so since we've been in lockdown during the pandemic, but it's been really nice to get a variety of different viewpoints, especially when you can do that sort of worldwide on a variety of different time zones all at the same time. So I really appreciate that. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to be a keynote speaker here of sorts. What I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about a project that I've been working on for the past 2 years, which involves thinking about transit customers and specifically looking at service improvements and the kinds of service improvements that might assist passengers having greater satisfaction. I'm not the first person to look at this problem, as you'll see, but it is one of those areas where in the context of where we sit in Southeast Queensland in Australia, this is a really timely and important area of study for them. So I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll briefly introduce what's going on, talk about TransLink, which is the public transport authority across Queensland, their customer satisfaction surveys, the Go Card transactions and Go Cards that they work with here in Queensland, and then real-time data that they have. And then just briefly walk through some of their underlying observations of customer satisfaction. If you're not familiar with public transport customer satisfaction, I'll give you a little bit of an idea of some of the things that we generally see across the world, really, in looking at customer satisfaction. I'll go into a little detail. I won't go through all the detailed statistical modeling unless you really like that, but I'll talk a little bit about our results, looking at demographics and travel patterns and how those affect customer satisfaction, the contributing factors to overall satisfaction, and then look at specific operational metrics and how those contribute to customer satisfaction. And then open it up for a little more discussion, some of the caveats associated with what we've discovered and other interesting avenues for investigation that are here. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be talking primarily about Southeast Queensland. That's an area that includes the greater Brisbane metropolitan area, including the Sunshine Coast, which is just north of Brisbane, the Gold Coast, which is just south of Brisbane, and Ipswich, which is to the west of Brisbane. The public transport services across the entire region are under the authority of TransLink, which is a unit within our overall Department of Transport and Main Roads here in Queensland. They contract with a number of private operators to oversee bus services, rail services, ferry services, and we have light rail services as well down on the Gold Coast here in Queensland. They're responsible for determining routes and operating hours, service frequencies, as well as managing different contracts and the service requirements that are listed in those public contracts that they have with those private operators. They do actually also run a number of regional services across some of the smaller towns along the coast of Queensland, as well as some of the more remote areas or rural areas of Queensland as well. Public transport in Southeast Queensland is made up of several different things. Here I just show a couple maps to give you an indication of what sort of travel is involved. The map that I'm displaying here is our train and light rail network map. Light rail is located in the lower right corner down on the Gold Coast. The rail network, as you can see, is essentially a radial network Everything goes through the center of Brisbane, which is right in the center of the map there. There isn't any services that really run sort of cross town or connecting the different rail services. They're all radial, essentially, to the center of Brisbane. We also are very fortunate in Brisbane to have a busway. We have a dedicated busway infrastructure that was put in on the order of, well, really about 20 years ago now, was the first pieces of the busway, and has been expanding ever since. These are dedicated right-of-way for buses, particularly along the southeast corridor out of the city, as well as a northern corridor that goes north from the center of the city. Allows you to travel around on bus during peak hours and off-peak hours without having to deal with mixed traffic or other things like that. Really a great system they have here in Brisbane. We do have some very high frequency bus services, typically operated on 5 to 10 minute headways during peak periods and at least 15-minute periods during off-peak periods. You can see the sort of map and the spaghetti there. We do have an interesting operating policy on our busway where services aren't constrained to the busway. They actually exit the busway and head off into neighborhoods. The principle there being that we don't like people to transfer when they get to the busway, so we'll just bring buses from neighborhoods right onto the busway and into the CBD. We also have a linear ferry system along the Brisbane River. It's a fairly extended river through the city, divides the city essentially in half with the north and south sections, and a lot of people use the ferry to not only travel around the city, but also to commute as a mode of transport. And we also have other sort of coverages in the Gold Coast as well as the Sunshine Coast, where there's a lot of service throughout both the residential and higher commercial and retail areas in various places outside of Brisbane itself. Across Southeast Queensland, we have a zone-based fare system. It operates with differential fares between peak and off-peak periods. The zone structure was recently revised. We used to have 23 different zones, and now we're down to just 8 zones. The curious thing that we try to do here in Southeast Queensland is that the fares are identical for all modes. So it's it will be the same cost to travel from origin to destination, whether you travel by rail or bus or ferry. There's no differential to ride rail or a difference to ride bus or to use the ferry. All the fares are identical. So they've managed to integrate the fare structures across all of the different modes across Southeast Queensland. In addition, you get a 30% discount if you pay your fare with a Go card. The Go card is a contactless smart card that we have here in Southeast Queensland, and you get a 30% discount on the fare if you pay with your Go card. The specific thing that I look at here in this particular presentation, or that I'll talk about here, is the differences between the way that operators will typically be measured in their contracts and how they might actually report their performance and what the customer actually sees. So to the operator, things that they're typically required to perform at in their performance metrics for TransLink are: how many trips have I missed? How many have I operated? Am I adhering to my desired frequency of service? How is your on-time performance doing? In TransLink, the only metrics that matter in terms of on-time performance is whether the bus or the train left its initial terminus on time, and also the midpoint along the route. So anywhere in between the initial terminus and the midpoint of the route, you can perform really badly, but it's not measured, or at least from the perspective of the operating performance. But of course, to the customer, they care about what the schedule says and whether you're actually showing up when you say the bus or train would show up. There's also issues, of course, with overall trip speed and travel time. If you're traveling in a mixed traffic corridor, how does the roadway congestion affect the operations? You want to make sure that you have sufficient capacity, so there could be crowding or availability of seat issues. Our train network consists of a variety of different train sets or consists. They can adapt the number of cars in each train consist depending on what they think is going to be the demand for service. We also have a variety of bus sizes that we operate on different routes depending on the size of the number, or really the number of passengers that we expect to use the service. The different local government authorities like Brisbane City Council and others are responsible for the amenities at stops and stations and making sure that those stops and stations are accessible. Those are typically things that we'll think about from the operator's perspective. To the passenger, of course, they need information in order to make a journey. They need to make access from their home or work or other place to the services themselves. They need to know whether they can wait comfortably at the stop, if it's hot or if it's raining, that could be an issue. They want to know whether the bus or train is actually going to be there on time. They want to know how to pay the fare appropriately, especially if they don't have a Go card or don't have enough funds on their Go card. They want to know whether they're going to get to their destination on time, and if they have to make a transfer, how convenient is that transfer going to be? Those are things that we don't typically measure from the operator's perspective, but are very critical to the passenger. To accommodate that, we'll collect certain performance measures for the operators, and then we'll ask our passengers using some kind of customer satisfaction survey how they're performing relative to what the passenger actually needs. But there's really no great connection between how they're measuring operating performance versus how they're actually treating the passenger and what level of service the passenger is actually experiencing. And that's what we were asked to explore. TransLink does maintain a performance dashboard. They put all their performance data out in public view. So we are very fortunate here in Queensland that our public transport operator and operators, as well as TransLink, do make a lot of their data publicly available. So it's all open data. They're happy to share all that information. Here you can see such great on-time running statistics, like 96% of the buses are running on time, and the trains are running on time, and trams are running 100% punctual. That depends in part on what they're actually measuring, as I mentioned earlier, as well as what the nature of those sorts of performance metrics are. On-time performance, the way we measure it here in Queensland, is you can be a minute early or 5 minutes late and still be considered on time. So that's how we measure on-time performance, for example. In terms of the customer satisfaction data, TransLink has recently instituted a new customer satisfaction survey. They call it their customer experience survey, but essentially is sent to people who've signed up to register their Go card. There's some incentive to do that because you can automatically top up your card when it gets low on value. It does a few other things to have your card registered, but it's not required in order to use the card. But the survey is sent on a monthly basis to approximately 10,000 people every month who are regular public transport users, one might expect, and ask them questions about their satisfaction with the overall experience with the network, the satisfaction with a specific recalled trip. So they will prompt you and say, on this particular day, at this particular time, you made this particular trip. Can we talk about that specific trip? That might seem a little creepy and a little a privacy issue, but you have to remember that these people have registered their card, and so they've agreed to allow themselves to be tracked as a specific individual within the public transport network. So that may or may not be too creepy from a privacy perspective. They're also asked about their onboard trip experience and the offboard trip experience, and various satisfaction with other network characteristics, the number of transfers they had to make, what the fare that they paid, the frequency of services that they experienced, and what information they were able to glean during their journey. And this is a standard Likert scale where it's on a 5-point scale where people can rate their satisfaction with these things. And you can see they publish all their data on how satisfied people are. If you looked at this table for more than a few minutes, and they separated it out by bus, ferry, train, and tram in this particular table, what you would see immediately by staring at some of these numbers that they have and the data that they collect is that people seem to be really happy. I mean, the lowest scores that you can see in this table are just under 4. And those usually have to deal with fares. People are very, in comparison or relatively unhappy with the fares that are charged. But in all other respects, they're quite satisfied. So if 4 is satisfied and 5 is very satisfied, then at least the baseline here, or at least the average scores tend to be above 4. And the higher scores tend to be about 4.3 or 4.4 for many of the characteristics of different types of trips. So they do quite well. They do track what is doing well, what's not doing well. And so that is one of the elements of their customer satisfaction survey. But you can look at different patterns and what things are getting better, what things are getting worse in their overall satisfaction. What makes life kind of interesting from our perspective is that they do collect go-card data, and we're willing to make a fair amount of that go-card data available to us. The nice thing about the go-card data, where people are recording their transactions with their fare cards, is it's a tap-on, tap-off system. So I know where people are getting on, where they're getting off, what time they're getting on, what time they're getting off. I know I can track a person or a card really over an extended period of time because the card ID itself is consistently hashed. So I don't know the card ID per se, but I know that the same card ID will have the same hashed ID at a different time. In addition, I know which route, which direction, which ID of the vehicle, and which run on that vehicle were being made at the time the person was on board. And as I mentioned earlier, because of the fare incentives associated with using a Go card, almost 90% of all the fare transactions that occur are related to these Go cards. A small, very small percentage, 10% or less, are made using cash or tickets that have been bought from a fare machine. Of those Go cards, only about 30% are registered. So you can imagine that the people who would register their card are people who are regular public transport users. These are people who would take advantage of things like automatic top up, their card value, and things like that, who actually register their cards. People who use their card frequently and aren't likely to throw out their card. It may seem kind of weird, but we have a very large percentage of the cards that we record in the system that are used maybe once or twice and then never seen again in the network. Either they're thrown away or are sitting in somebody's dad drawer at home where they just sort of store extra Go cards. Only about, I would say, 20 to 30% of the cards do we see actually more than 10 uses of the card in any given year. So it's a relatively minor fraction of cards that are regularly used. And of that, we think most of the cards that we see that are used on a somewhat regular basis are the ones who are registered. So when I talk about registered users, and those are the ones that we're actually surveying in our customer satisfaction survey, but these are probably a fairly biased group of public transport users. This isn't the universe of public transport users. This is more likely to be people who are regular users people who would have an incentive to use public transport because they have a card and they're already registered in the system and are using that frequently. So that's a caveat across everything that I'm about to talk about. The good news is that we do have that data and we can see what a person's experience is directly and their repeated experiences with the public transport system. We also have, like many public transport agencies, we have GTFS data, we have GTFS real-time data, we have the GoCard data, and then at least the intent is to get about 10,000 customer experience surveys per month. So far, the experience has been about 6,000 per month, and of course, that dropped significantly during the pandemic, and still hasn't recovered yet. As Dave Hencher was mentioning earlier in his presentation, we're only seeing about 80% so far of the public transport customers coming back, and I think that's probably going to stay that way in Queensland as well as other places, as he was mentioning. So the good news is we have all that data together, so that's good. The intent of this research project was essentially to see what we could do about putting the objective measures that we can get out of the GTFS real-time data and connect that with customer satisfaction data and see what was the correlation between actual performance of the service on a given day that the operator might be familiar with or that the operator is reporting through the GTFS real-time, and connecting that to people's recollection of how the service was for them, both across the previous month and also about a specific trip that they were asked to recall. In this project, I didn't have a PhD student to work on this, but I did have several undergraduate honors students that worked with me. Chanwei Yin, who's now doing his PhD at the University of Melbourne, Alexis Deguerme, and Dorian Sabatier, who were visiting students from Imperial College, London. Alexis actually came and visited us. Dorian, unfortunately, because of the pandemic, was a visiting student from Imperial College, but he never made it to Australia, but nonetheless managed to do his honors thesis. The important thing, I think, the first thing that we realized was that we had to try and plug all this data together. So we had some data from before the pandemic back in 2019 that connected roughly about 17,000 customer experience surveys with specific GoCard records with each trip that they took. And the very interesting part of that is that we could essentially connect most of the trips that were observed in the customer experience surveys with actual GoCard records. So we could actually see the same trips that appeared in the customer experience survey and extract the data associated with their individual trip. The other piece of information that we got was we actually got passenger loading on buses and observed bus travel times. And that meant that we could actually connect bus performance directly with GoCard trips. You can see in this table here sort of the overall data size of different data sets that we were working with. After cleaning some of the data and making sure that all the data could merge and that the data was complete, we ended up using somewhere around 70% of the total bus records that we had, and almost, well, somewhere between 80 and almost 90% of the transactions on train, tram, and ferry. The one thing that made us very happy is the sample sizes. These are big sample sizes, so we felt like we at least had a good representation of the ability to connect operating performance with satisfaction. From the data that we had, here you can see different levels of satisfaction associated with different questions associated in the customer satisfaction surveys. Things that scored extremely well our drivers, our bus drivers tend to be very friendly. Our staff for public transport tend to be very friendly. People feel safe on board. The things that scored lowest were the cost of the trip. I mentioned that briefly earlier. Whether it was comfortable on board. Some of our drivers are a little more aggressive and tend to be a source of complaints for our passengers. But overall, again, as I was mentioning earlier, we're scoring well above 4, which means that people are generally quite satisfied, at least in average with the service. Once you look at sort of the metrics on the previous page were largely around onboard services. This second one deals with overall network services as well as the station amenities and other things like that. Again, scoring relatively well. The frequency of service people always complain about because we do have a lot of services that run a half an hour headways or slower. As a result, people find that quite annoying, especially if they miss a service. They're ending up waiting for significantly long periods of time. The overall price to value or value for money is also rated typically very low. People don't feel like they're getting their money's worth on the fares that are charged. So another low score here is also the ease of transferring. Certainly within mode, transferring is actually quite easy. So if you're transferring from train to train or bus to bus, those transfers are generally facilitated fairly well at various transfer locations in those networks. But the transfers from ferry to bus, ferry to train, train to bus, bus to train, those are really horrible transfers. Typically involve a significantly long walk in uncomfortable conditions out in the open, and it's the navigation and wayfinding for those sorts of activities are really poor. What's interesting is once you start looking at differences across different demographic characteristics or other things like that, people in Southeast Queensland tend to show similar characteristics to what we find in other parts of the world. That is, females are generally much more satisfied with the service than males. That's with a baseline of people who identify as other or don't give their gender as in response to the satisfaction. So you can see here that generally men and women both have higher measures of satisfaction, but females are generally higher. People who have disabilities tend to have much lower values of satisfaction, perhaps not surprisingly. And in terms of age groups, we also see, like many others have seen, that as you get older and older, people tend to be more satisfied with the service. That could be a combination of a cohort effect, as well as people who get older tend to be less, or maybe have lower expectations of the service and are hence much more satisfied along the way. People tend to be very satisfied with our ferry and tram service. The train satisfaction is fairly low. This was in a period of time when our train service was experiencing a number of significant breakdowns. There were many incidents that occurred in our train network around this time, and as a result, that tended to lower the overall satisfaction with train service in general. One of the other things that we commonly find is that people who travel in peak periods are less satisfied than people who travel in off-peak, as well as the fact that people who travel very frequently are less satisfied than people who travel infrequently. People who travel infrequently tend to be much more satisfied. The frequency numbers that I have here have to do with how many times they traveled on public transport in the course of a month. So less than 4 means I made less than 4 trips in the course of a month. 4 to 20 is, again, 4 to 20 trips per month. We have another category, the baseline category there is 40 and above, 40 or more trips. That would be equivalent to commuting every day. And as a result, their satisfaction is much lower. Finally, our tertiary students, university students, tend to be more satisfied than the average. That's because there's a lot of service that across Brisbane is oriented toward the universities being our major trip generators across Southeast Queensland for public transport trips. This slide more or less summarizes what I was just talking about. What we found is not that different from what other people have found through customer satisfaction surveys. So I'm going to move quickly over this, but it's not like we're the first people to look at customer satisfaction. These types of trends are quite common in various larger metropolitan areas around the world in terms of trends in customer satisfaction. There are a number of things that were brought up in the literature, though, that are really important to start looking at in terms of what factors actually influence satisfaction. And we looked at two different things. One is that basically, if I look at all those different ways of measuring satisfaction or the different attributes of my travel experience, some of them are really not separable. Really, they kind of get lumped into certain categories, but how we lump them into categories could be quite important. We used a latent factor analysis or a set of simultaneous equations to unpack that. And then we also looked at things that could be considered asymmetric effects, where some factors didn't matter if you performed poorly, but if you performed above average, that would be notable. Some things they didn't care if you performed above average, but if you performed poorly, that would be really bad. And then other things that are just whether you perform well or poorly would be recorded in that way by the customers. And we were helped along in those sorts of views by a number of recent publications. There's a whole set of these. I just picked out a few here and just talked about many, but certainly for my honors students, they were very excited to discover that somebody else had looked at this, and that gave them ideas of things that they could try with our data. And so we weren't reinventing the wheel here. This was something that we had looked through a fair amount of recent research that had been published in this area. Of note, there was a recent paper by Mahmoud Mezba in Iran looking at metro passengers in Tehran. There was other work that was being done in Santiago down in Chile by a group of people associated with the Pontifical University there, as well as some work that Oded Katz has been doing with his students in TU Delft, so among many others. What we discovered is that there are certain groups of factors across all of those elements of satisfaction that I talked about earlier that seem to fit together reasonably well. One is that I had this sort of onboard experience, which explains a strong correlation among variables or measures of satisfaction across the onboard experience: comfort, cleanliness, feeling safe, whether the driver's friendly, if you have seating, and how easy it is to move around on board. Those are things that are associated with the onboard experience. A separate one has to do with timing and cost. Separate set of measures as to whether the service is on time, how long it takes me to get to my destination, how much it costs. A third area of information availability, getting information, both information on board as well as information at the stop about the services. And finally, my experience at the stop. All those sort of form strongly correlated options that affect my overall level of satisfaction. For the non-bus options, the timing and fare and information seem to all fit together. And so many of the same kind of latent factors fit together for non-bus options, except that both the timing of the services as well as the level of information and what information there is about whether the service is running on time or not is important. We also looked at asymmetric effects, where we have these sort of basic factors where if the service is poor, that negatively affects my satisfaction, but if it's above average, it doesn't matter that much, versus exciting factors, which if they're good, will really positively influence my satisfaction. And we discovered that, at least on the bus, things that made me feel better were if my journey time are these exciting elements where if my journey time is shorter than I expect, if I get the trip is less expensive than I expected, or the stop really has some nice amenities, those things are very exciting to me. Other things that will hurt my experience would be the comfort on board, feeling safe on board, whether the service is on time, whether I can get a seat. If the bus is crowded, that's maybe something that really negatively affects my satisfaction of service. For non-bus options, the accessibility or the convenience of getting to the starting location and the comfort of the ride overall were things that could be very exciting if they're very convenient. But then the things that could hurt my overall level of satisfaction as basic elements could be feeling safe on board, the availability of seating. If I have to stand on a train or a ferry, I might really not like that very much. The availability of information, cleanliness of stations, and feeling safe at stations. So safety is a much bigger issue on many of the non-bus services, particularly train and ferry services, which operate on lower headways. So this just briefly summarizes those particular points. I'm happy to share these slides, but essentially the points that I've just made on the previous slides are essentially what I've wrapped up here. Then I can look at specific trips and say, well, did a person's overall satisfaction with their travel on a specific trip, was that correlated with actually the performance on that specific trip? So if the bus was running late, did they notice the punctuality and decrease their satisfaction because the on-time performance was lower, or their journey time was longer, or the bus or train was crowded at the particular time, and that decreased their satisfaction on that specific trip. So the question really there was, we can measure things like on-time performance, we can measure overall travel times. That was in both the sources of data for the operations from GTFS real time, but we also had people's measures that they reported for that specific trip. And what we wanted to do was see if people really notice, or whether that really affects their satisfaction when the performance is bad, or alternately, if they decrease their level of satisfaction, was that related to poor performance from these traditional metrics? And to do that, we did an ordered logit model where we looked at specific metrics, looking at SAT3, which is the overall satisfaction with the journey. The things that seemed to affect people's levels of satisfaction had to do with the schedule deviation at the boarding stop. That is, was the bus on time? The load that they experienced when they got on, so could they actually find a seat? And the maximum load that occurred during the trip. That is, how crowded the bus or train got during the journey. When you look at specific measures of satisfaction associated with punctuality or journey time or availability of seating, that's where you get things like the schedule deviation at the boarding stop, differences in journey time were important. We also found that even for punctuality, if the number of people on board affected your perceptions of punctuality. So people were less satisfied when there were a lot of people on board with how punctual the service was. If they knew the bus was running late and it was more crowded, that made the effect of punctuality worse. Similar things can be seen for journey time. So if the bus is more crowded or the train is more crowded, that made them that gave them a lower score on their satisfaction with the journey time. And similarly, of course, with the availability of seating, the load on when they boarded, and the load during the trip had a significant effect on their level of satisfaction with that measure. So what we saw is, at least with the travel times and the on-time performance, the effect of having many other people or a lot of crowding on your vehicle actually affected those things even more. So you end up with a mixed effect there from a combination of factors influencing satisfaction. The other thing we were asked to look at by TransLink was, well, what does that mean in terms of how could we actually improve people's satisfaction? Where would we get the largest incremental improvement in satisfaction by changing things? And if I improve my on-time performance, or if I changed my journey time, made buses run faster, or if I added additional capacity on routes, would that really increase people's satisfaction? And this table gives me the marginal effects. What I can see from this is that these numbers are rather small. So the short answer is yes, by improving on-time performance, reducing journey times, and decreasing load factors, obviously that's going to improve satisfaction, but the levels of satisfaction aren't going to skyrocket once you do that. They're going to be small incremental improvements in satisfaction. The big takeaway from this really had to do with adding capacity. So the biggest issue that seemed to come out from our study was that the largest issue that was faced on many routes is that they were reaching capacity. They had a lot of standees on bus and train service, and that was really decreasing people's satisfaction, not only in their experience of the availability of seating, but also negatively affecting their perceptions of the time spent on board. Finally, the last thing I'll mention is whether these effects were network-wide or specific. So I can say, well, I've got 17,000 people that I've reviewed, that I've interviewed for this customer satisfaction, but to what extent do I really need to improve network-wide performance, or can I just focus on a few routes that seem to be underperforming and really improve some of my satisfaction by influencing a couple routes on those same metrics? So here, this set of graphs gives a sort of a geographic perspective. And the first question we asked was, gee, are people from certain areas around Brisbane grumpier or less satisfied than other areas? And the table, or the graph on the left, gives the variation in journey time that we observe in terms of how long it actually takes them to travel, versus the graph on the right, which gives the variation in their level of satisfaction with particular trips. And what you'll see is that actually they're sort of slightly inversely correlated. That places where it's green, where you've had very good journey times on the left, are areas where I see more brownish colors or reddish colors on the right. And that seemed to be kind of odd to us, that people who had longer journey times seemed to be actually slightly happier and more satisfied with the service. So what that told us was that we really don't see any strong spatial correlations per se in people's level of satisfaction and how that relates to journey time. But the other thing that we did look at was specifically looking at bus seating and occupancy and how that affects people. We see a similar kind of trend there as well, that there weren't necessarily strong spatial clustering of satisfaction with occupancy or the experience of crowding in the service, as well as the variation in their overall satisfaction with a particular journey. But once you get around to specific routes, and I don't show it directly in this set of slides, but once you get around to specific routes, it turns out that certain routes where there are very high load factors, that's where you see the largest deviation in overall satisfaction. So what we learned from that is that if they can manage to add additional capacity to many of these routes where they are experiencing very high load factors, that would have a significant impact on improving satisfaction. They didn't need to do that system-wide, but really on specific routes where there were very high load factors. So that's something that we took away, that it wasn't necessarily a system-wide issue, but really on specific routes. Okay, I'll stop here. I did have a couple caveats. Really, we've been following the satisfaction data since the pandemic. One of the things that we've observed overall is that the overall satisfaction with the service has gone up, which is a good thing, I guess, to say. The one thing we, of course, observe is that the people who are sticking with public transport during the pandemic are typically essential workers, or people who have a strong affinity or loyalty to the public transport service. And as a result, they tend to have higher satisfaction. So the fact that overall satisfaction has gone up during the pandemic doesn't necessarily mean that the service overall is really great. It just means that the people who are still responding to their customer satisfaction surveys are at least either essential workers or people who are really finding that service to be quite useful during the pandemic. Of course, in this data, we've ignored people who haven't registered their Go cards, and those tend to be less frequent users. Of course, we don't know anything about people who don't use public transport and what would really make them switch. So this data set doesn't help us at all with the question of would we attract more people to public transport if we offered greater capacity or made the service run on time. We haven't looked in detail on subgroups, specific groups like student groups or senior groups, to see what their major pet peeves are. I did have one honors student look at satisfaction across different disability groups and discovered that, well, perhaps not too surprisingly, that disability groups tend to have a lower level of satisfaction, but the level of satisfaction that they experience is caused by a number of specific factors associated typically with bus service, which is problematic in access for people with disabilities. And we're still continuing our work looking at differences in satisfaction by route. That's work that's ongoing with an additional honors student that I'm working with now. So there's a lot more that can be done here. I think it's exciting to see a lot of other people looking at issues of customer satisfaction and how that relates to improving operational performance. It was brought to my attention in making a similar presentation earlier this year that Dave Henscher has even done some work looking at the correlation of customer satisfaction and the costs of improving customer satisfaction. We haven't gone quite that far yet in our work to look at how much would it actually cost on a per bus or per service to actually improve customer satisfaction by spending money to improve the service. That's something that others have looked at. We haven't gotten quite there in our work to date. So anyway, I'll stop there. I see that there are a number of perhaps comments or questions in the chat, and I'll turn it over to whoever the host is at this point, if it's still Ellie. So
yes, thank you, Mark, for a very interesting presentation. Yeah, there are actually a couple of questions. The first question is from Aina that she missed a part when you explained about registered, what a registered card means. And Berang actually attempted to answer that, but
okay.
Would you like to answer that, what actually means from a registered card? What's the difference?
Sure. So you can buy a Go card from or get a Go card from a number of different locations. They're sold at 7-Elevens and a lot of other places, and of course from vending machines at the various train stations, busway stations, and other things like that. Associated with the card is a serial number for the card, you can use the card and top it up on your own. You can top it up at a variety of different locations by paying cash to do that. You need to register. The only need you would have to register your card would be if you actually wanted the ability to somebody to return the card to you in case you lost it, because it does have the serial number on it, or if you wanted to arrange automatic top up of the card. So the card works as a debit card. Once you get down to zero, you're not allowed to travel with the card anymore. And so if you wanted to automatically top up from your checking account, savings account, or something like that, you have to actually formally register your card and a payment mechanism with TransLink. And that's the advantage of registering your card. I know for the Opal card in Sydney, they used to have a different policy with the Opal card that you couldn't actually use the card unless you registered it. But I think they've abandoned that policy since. But as a result, the Opal card, much larger proportion of their cards are registered compared with the Go card here in Southeast Queensland.
Yes. So Mark, Einat asks if the registered card holders represent captivated audience. Einat, you can unmute yourself and ask your question directly. If you want to explain what do you mean from captivate audience.
All right. Hi there. Hello. Thank you, Mark, for the very interesting presentation. As someone who used Go card, and my Go card is registered, I think it was registered because I get the concession, the student concession.
Yes.
And then what it occurred to me that it might be that it's not necessarily enthusiasts or people who's really interested in it. So it can be represent a certain segment of the population. Could it be?
Yes. So you are correct. There were a variety of different mechanisms that TransLink has tried in terms of getting students to register their cards or at least sign up for concession fares, which we could go into great detail. But there are certain populations that tend to be more likely to register their cards, students being one of them. Are the people who use registered cards primarily transit captive? I would say probably not. We do have people who use a registered Go card infrequently, only a few times a month when they make their travel. So it doesn't necessarily imply that these people are always using public transport. On the other hand, they're more likely to just use it infrequently. So we haven't, curiously, we don't know how representative the population of registered Go card users is in terms of the frequency of use. So we haven't looked at that statistic, but that would be an interesting thing to look at. So are these people who use it very frequently or not? Or what sort of sampling technique are they using to sample these registered card users when they're doing these customer satisfaction surveys?
Yes. Yeah, I think one of the motivations for registering their cards would be that top-up option. So I would say, frequent public transport users probably are more interested in registering than the infrequent one, but it is interesting to investigate that. Mark, there's another question from Mahmoud Mesbah. Greetings and thanks for sharing your Friday afternoon. Do you have the results for ages below 40 years old?
Yeah, so the reason why I didn't include those in that specific table that I showed there is that those were not statistically significant. So it wasn't until we got to the age of 40 that became statistically significant. So for ages under 40, we had an effect that was, let me see if I can pull that up. Yeah. Here, we had the effect that for tertiary students, it was higher, but the effect for people essentially between the ages of 18 and 40 is all essentially statistically indistinguishable, is the best way to describe that.
Thank you. Another question from Dr. Niraj Saxena from the Australian Road Research Board. Thanks, Professor, for such an informative talk. Was wondering if the impact of weather on CES modeling could also be looked at. What do you reckon the trend would be?
That would be very interesting to look at. We have not accounted for anything associated with weather here. That's another data issue. The free data that we get from the Bureau of Meteorology here in Queensland, at least, is aggregated at the daily level. So we could look at temperatures and rainfall, but they're aggregated at a 24-hour level. So temperature might be a good metric. But in terms of whether it was raining when a person was traveling and that affected their trip, we wouldn't exactly know, depending on when the rainfall occurred in the course of the day. So, but that's an interesting thing to look at. We do have the time of day when people traveled under their selected trip. So if we had a little bit more disaggregate weather data, it would be very interesting to see if that influenced their satisfaction.
Yes, indeed, it would be interesting. So Professor David Hensher also posted a couple of useful local papers. Yeah, there are two posts. One of his papers in 2003 and 2015 about customer service quality and benchmarking,
yes,
which I think would be useful for your team.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and also there's another question from Joel Chia. Hi, Professor. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. My question is, in one of the presentations earlier today on public transport and travel behavior, Shuli Luo used data mining on social media sites to collect opinions on MTR, which is, I think, Hong Kong rail transport.
Yes.
Satisfaction. I was just wondering if these means of data collection could be used to supplement the transport service survey that are currently conducted, like the data mining on social media sites.
Yes. As far as I know, while I think they do monitor Twitter and Facebook and a few other places for general comments, I don't think that data is regularly harvested by TransLink to look at in terms of public sentiment. That's a great question, though. I know that we haven't looked at it, I don't think, in Southeast Queensland, but I know in the work that you cite from Hong Kong is a very interesting case as well. And I know that there are many other places around the world that have really looked at customer sentiment analysis from crowdsourced data and that sort of social media, which I think could be very, very interesting and very insightful after you've sort of filtered out the trolling and other things like that come with any sort of service disruption or other things like that may affect people's impressions of public transport.
Yes, I believe that, I mean, the sample size that you have is sufficient, to be honest, but the social media, because I also did that kind of looking at the sentiments by data mining from the Twitter. It was about like Bitcoin, but
Yes.
I wanted to say that it's very challenging because sometimes even when you extract those keywords, even if they look as positive sentiment, but when you really read the sentence, it's contrary to what you expect. It kind of there sometimes the meanings are the opposite. So I would say that there would be lots of manual checking also that might be required, not just using those.
Yeah, we do have the dilemma. I would only just add the dilemma that because our sample is probably fairly heavily biased toward regular users, more regular users of public transport. There may be other ways of getting sentiment from the public beyond just asking people who are regular go-kart users or regular public transport users. There could be better ways of gauging public acceptance and public understanding of these various performance metrics that go well beyond what we're doing with our customer satisfaction surveys. So, but I appreciate that comment. That's very insightful. Yeah.
Thank you. So there's one question from Kendall, and he asked, hi Mark, I was wondering if hot sun, humidity, and heavy rain created issues for customers, such as the need for bus shelters, shade tree, and aircon in vehicles, sweaty walks when transferring, and services held up by local flooding. I couldn't see a category for that in your survey, but thought these might be issue of subtropical Brisbane, at least during summer.
Yes, those are great comments, and I think reflect a little bit on the weather comment I was making earlier. The one thing that we had in our data, this particular data set that we had was from a July to September timeframe, which tends to be probably the driest and nicest weather of the year in Brisbane. We tend not to get a lot of rain during that period of time, and the temperatures are relatively quite bearable, let's put it that way. So we didn't really expect to see major effects of rain or high temperatures during that period. So we weren't as sensitive to that. I think if we were to look at this over a broader period of time, especially in the summer months, that would be much more of an important factor to consider. I might also mention that my colleague, Jonathan Corcoran, who was doing some work previously, has also looked at changes in bus passenger behavior during rainy times, or whether the weather affects people's travel behavior, and has done some really interesting work in that case, where people do seem to have different behaviors during ugly weather than during normal sunny and mild days here in Brisbane. But you can talk to Jonathan about that. That's some really interesting work that he's done. So,
okay, great. Thank you, Mark. So perhaps I can ask my last question, which is mine. So are you planning to again redo the survey with the same respondents to see that how their satisfaction might change over the time?
I totally agree with a comment that David Hencher made earlier in his presentation about the value of having longitudinal data. It's really great when you can look at people's satisfaction and how that changes over time, particular individuals, and what made them feel better or worse about the service over time. Unfortunately, the way that the current customer satisfaction surveys are set up here in Queensland is that they're randomly sampled. So there's no way of tracking the same individual across multiple surveys. And the company that manages the survey process here in Queensland does not track the same individuals across over time. And so unfortunately, with the survey the way it is, we've encouraged them to consider longitudinal surveys where they can sample the same people maybe once every 6 months, or at least some kind of regular surveying of people about their sentiments, but that's currently not in place. So.
I see. Yes. Yeah, I understand that.
Great idea.
Yeah, thank you so much. There are heaps of thanks in the chat box. Yeah, so we're a bit over time, but that was very insightful presentation. And thank you, Mark. And please, guys, if you are a night owl, please stay awake for the Western tracks. We'll have the last keynote speaker of the BTR, Professor Donald Schub, which is a distinguished research professor from the University of California, and he's going to talk about the high cost of free parking in Paradise. It's going to be a very interesting talk, but yeah, I understand that might not be good for us here in Australia. But anyhow, the recordings will be shared, and you can watch it later.
At least
So
it's
thank
at
Yeah.
least it's Saturday morning here in Australia. So at least if you stay up all night, you can at least sleep through your Saturday. And most of us are on lockdown anyway, so we're not going anywhere on Saturday anyway. So stay up and watch. There are some really great talks actually I saw. So I'm tempted to wake up early at least for some of the later talks on that one. But yeah,
Oh,
great.
amazing.
It's a great program.
you.
So.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, everyone. Please just submit your recommendations about the next year of BTR, and also please raise your hand for helping and volunteering. It's just a free conference, and we're just trying to provide a platform for removing our carbon footprint, but also enabling everyone to present their research and share within the network globally. And thank you, and have a wonderful day or night.